Assassin's Creed Shadows is the latest in what is becoming one of the most divisive series out there. Ever since making a push towards more RPG-focused games in 2017, the Assassin's Creed series has been stuck grappling with the consequences of change. While many determined that the series was too similar between entries, now that there's change, consistency looks a lot kinder. One way the series strayed was in regards to its namesake. Odyssey saw you under the role of Mysthios, and Valhalla saw us playing as a Viking, both characters outright rejecting the creed. Mirage was the first step in Ubisoft's attempt to make the games more about assassins, and it was well received. But it's clear that the series needed more. This was their answer. Is it a good answer? Well, let's get into the review, but before we do, let's chat about bias. As always, I'm going to go over any special treatment I've received and talk about my history with the series, but I'll try to keep it quick. I was able to remotely play a preview for about 3 hours a few months ago and received a review code for free from Ubisoft. As for my history with the series, I've been a fan of nearly every entry, finding things to love in both the new and old titles, and I have a particular fondness for open world games. With that in mind, let's see if Assassin's Creed Shadows is worth your money, and as always, make sure this isn't the only review you watch, so your purchase is as informed as possible. And I'll keep the spoilers to a minimum, only showing footage and discussing topics relating to the first act of the game, with one exception that we'll get into later. It's important to note the context for this game, not just in the current gaming landscape, but for Ubisoft. If you've been around the Assassin's Creed fanbase for the last 2 decades, then you'll know that feudal Japan has been on nearly every fan's wish list, and has always, in my mind, been Ubisoft's ace in the hole. If Ubisoft wants their game to sell, this was a surefire way of doing so. Assassins, ninjas, shinobis all overlap so much, especially when it comes to the badass factor, and ideally, a game in Japan for Ubisoft should be a layup. But the shadow of Jin Sakai hangs heavy over Ubisoft's efforts. It's important to remember that this does not simply need to be a good game, but a game equal to or greater than Ghost of Tsushima. Tsushima has flaws, but I'd say Ubisoft has their work cut out for them. Let's start with the world design, which has always been Ubisoft's strong suit, and that's not different here. Japan is downright gorgeous, full stop. There were constant points where I just admired the world around me and slowed down for a bit, smelled the cherry blossoms, and admired the flora that shines during all seasons. Speaking of which, the different seasons is such an excellent idea that I hope it continues into the rest of the series. I love winter settings, so being able to get in one of my favorite series is a highlight. Cities feel full of life and environments are detailed out the wazoo, but this is Ubisoft, so it's no surprise. Even in the games people don't like from them, it's hard to deny that their worlds aren't top-notch. Animation-wise, we see a similar level of quality, whether that's so many takedowns or simply admiring the physics on Naoe's robes and hair. It's not all great though. When you make mistakes, Naoe's falling animation is the same animation we've seen from Origins, and it still looks way too floaty and off. For as much as busting through doors as Yasuke is fun, it lacks a real punch, making it seem like these massive wooden doors are made from paper mache. It's strange too, because Yasuke's animations in combat look great. He swings with insane power, and this extends to Naoe too. I mean, when it comes to combat, the game's looking arguably the best it ever has. But it's disappointing to see that some animations don't get the same treatment. Fortunately, polish wasn't really a concern for me, because throughout the entire playthrough I had no frame drops, the game maintained a constant 60 FPS at 4K on performance mode, and when it comes not just to Ubisoft games but early games as a whole, this is one of the more polished games I've played. Shadows was delayed twice for a total of 5 months, and I think that delay was wholeheartedly worth it, because the game shows no signs of being rushed. Now granted, I'm notoriously lucky with this stuff, like when Jedi Survivor came out, it ran horribly for basically everyone but me, so maybe double check performance on other reviews. Okay, let's talk about the gameplay here, because it is in many ways strong, but in other ways disappointing. Let's start with Traversal, which is where much of the disappointment is. Parkour is a little different this time around, especially when climbing mountains, as you need to climb proper handholds and can't just Spider-Man up a cliff like in previous entries. This requires some more thought from the player, which I like a lot, but when it comes to freerunning in the city, we see that there is a severe lack of momentum, making chases a battle against the controls as much as it is against your enemies. Essentially, when sprinting at a wall and climbing up that wall, you'll stand up and need to press the sprint button again, but it's not totally clear what stops your sprint and what doesn't, meaning there's a lot of guessing and a lot of clicking the left stick, like I'm reminding Naoe to get a move on. This could be fixed by changing sprint to R2 and making it activated by holding the button, but then we interfere with the same button used to initiate a heavy attack. I wish we could just hold the sprint the whole time. Early on there's a chase sequence and it's a perfect example, and I'm sure you'll notice it too. I was also disappointed to not see side or back ejects here, but truthfully, a lot of the buildings are so low that I didn't often find it necessary. There were still some times when I did, and it sucked when I tried to back eject and ended up just missing, but despite that, I like the movement here, especially now as she just flies across the map, lending credence to her agility. Horses move fine enough, but are constantly getting stuck on obstacles, take a while to turn around, and generally just don't feel great, but the grappling hook works the same way it did in the preview, which is good, because generally, I like it, especially when we get the ability to use it to climb to the ceiling. When talking about stealth, it's obvious that you'll be seeing much more Naoe than Yasuke, and that's because she is the stealth specialist, but also because in many ways, I find Yasuke to be redundant and nowhere near as cool as Naoe. Just to be clear, I don't care for the culture war BS surrounding the game, and my feelings here are strictly to do with the gameplay. Let's think about the fun stuff in Assassin's Creed. Parkour, stealth, combat. Yasuke is hardly equipped to do the first two, and when it comes to combat, he trivializes a lot of the encounters, and has less interesting weapons than Naoe. That, and I mean the fashion is way better. Can we get a drip check on this? I've never felt this cool in an Assassin's Creed before. This is awesome. Back to stealth, it's the best in the series. There isn't much room for social stealth, but society does play a role in your information phase. Talking to people will yield information, and there's often more than one way to track down your target. With that said, the stealth here is far more traditional, opting for us to climb to a high point, survey an area, mark enemies, and swoop in to take out a base. I like the layouts of enemies, and some of the more difficult challenges were difficult for the right reasons, causing me to bash my head against a wall with joy trying over and over again. There's still the issue of one-shot assassinations though. Some enemies can't be assassinated with you either not stabbing them at all, or it leaves them with less health. This was a form of progression gating seen in the other RPG games, but unlike those other games, you can use a setting to keep it on. I chose to play with instant assassinations off because it was the intended experience and I wanted that experience. I found myself not having too much of an issue with this feature, except when it came to finishing off the enemies I weakened. Naoe is weak as hell. She does okay damage, but often goes down in 2 or 3 hits. If you can't one-shot an enemy, then you can bet the following fight will be tough, and if you're like me, you'll die plenty of times on it. The remedy to this is upgrading your gear and skills. Upgrades are handled in an interesting way. Each upgrade is split between different categories and tiers, with new tiers being unlocked through knowledge points. You get knowledge points by performing specific side activities. The activities themselves can be a bit mind-numbing, but I like the thematic idea that you can do more once you know more, and it encourages you to explore around the map and get lost in the world Ubisoft built. Previous RPG titles encouraged you to do side activities by putting experience behind it, ensuring anyone who was focusing on the story would be stabbing a lowly grunt 100 times to get by, but this alternative works so much better. It allows side activities to be beneficial to not just your level, but your skills as a whole. Combat itself is standard fare. Parries grant a stagger, which opens the enemy for more damage, and a perfect dodge does the same. Some enemies can throw out combos that you need to deflect in their entirety before they can be staggered, and enemies have armor too. And I like that the combat is generally more mechanics-based, instead of ability-based. I found myself in Odyssey and Valhalla just farming for my abilities to do damage instead of engaging in the actual combat, but here, there was a good balance, with some abilities being fine but on short cooldowns, and the better ones being on longer cooldowns. The different weapons all have advantages and abilities that make them fun to use, and even after beating the game, I want to start a new playthrough because I didn't engage in certain weapons enough, like the teppo and the bow. Both in combat and stealth, you can call in allies to help you and use tools to aid in stealth, like kunai, and they're all good, and your carrying capacity is low enough to prevent players from entirely relying on them. For those concerned about gear, levels, and other RPG mechanics that were generally disliked in the last 3 entries, then bad news, it's still here, though I guess less strict. Unlike previous games, the scaling isn't as harsh, meaning I could easily take down enemies above my level, and especially by the mid-game, once I had a build that synergized with my abilities, the game became a cakewalk. Boss fights literally ended in seconds. It was a bit of a joke actually, I won't lie. And the same was true for assassinations. Like Odyssey and Origins, if you spec out your character right, then you'll be one-shotting basically every enemy. The problem is, once again, the game doesn't tutorialize this very well, but at this point, I think the majority of people who complain about the games having damage sponge enemies likely aren't engaging with the mechanics at all. If you find yourself stuck, reconsider your gear, your approach, and your build, and you'll see how easy it can be to break the game. This job is twice as hard though, as you have 2 characters to build out, but thankfully, the levels carry between the 2. Different activities will reward different gear, and a lot of the gear you find will scale to your level, so I never felt like I had to grind as Yasuke to catch him up to speed when I spent a few hours playing as Naoe. I think having 2 characters solves an issue created when the series went into being an RPG. Early Assassin's Creeds let you be the perfect assassin and fighter, but in the newer games, a character like that can't be possible until the mid to end game. With the 2 characters, we can have our Yasuke and eat it too. Unlike some of the other games, there is a wider variety of side quests this time around, many of them specifically seeing us just admiring our surroundings and getting engrossed in the shinobi and samurai fantasy. We can meditate, practice our kata skills, paint animals, explore shrines and temples, and these are light in terms of gameplay, and in the case of the kata training were downright boring, but I can appreciate what they were going for, especially when most of the time it does land. There are contracts for us to accept, different organizations to wipe out, and of course, people to assassinate and outposts to clear. A lot of the objectives won't be too different from the things you do in the story, but they all offered excuses to engage with the combat and stealth, which were both, as established, pretty fun. The story is going to be difficult to talk about because I want to avoid spoilers, so bear with me as I can't share specific details, but generally, my thoughts are the story is pretty solid. I think it starts strong, has a second act that is just a tad too long, and has a great third act completely destroyed by a botched ending. Once we actually get things moving, working together with Yasuke is fun, and the way the two stories are told was intuitive and emotional, though I did find myself enjoying Yasuke's side a bit more. Nearly the entire game can be played as either Naoe or Yasuke, but both have some independent quests that further their personal journeys alongside their shared goal of taking down the Order within Japan. The structure actually reminded me most of both Valhalla and the first Assassin's Creed. The group arrives at a different region, learns about the local politics and how their target is involved with it, deciphers who their target is and where they'll be, and then takes them down while meeting characters and visiting locations from their respective pasts. It borders very closely on being repetitive, but some of the later regions especially have mix-ups that make them a lot of fun. Once we hit Act 3, the story picks up considerably and I was more invested than ever. It felt like it was all leading to a big grand finale, but instead, the game has what I consider to be one of the worst endings in the series. I might be missing something, but I even messaged other YouTubers who were playing the game to make sure I wasn't missing something. I have never seen a game end so abruptly in this series, and it doesn't even feel like a sequel bait, it just felt incomplete. Fortunately, the epilogue was heartfelt and did something to chase a sour taste in my mouth, but damn, I have no idea what happened here. If the real ending is locked behind some kind of DLC, I will be extremely disappointed. Speaking of disappointment, the cutscenes and general way the story was told left a lot to be desired. I had praised this initially in my preview, that the cutscenes seemed a lot more dynamic, but it now seems like that section we played was just especially polished, because there were plenty of moments where characters had too long of a pause in between lines, visual glitches that took me out of the cutscene, and major revelations that were delivered as if it was another side quest. There are still some great cutscenes here, especially near the end and beginning, but a lot of the mid-game was full of basic talking head cutscenes. Also, while Yasuke's voice actor does a great job, Naoe's was incredibly inconsistent. Some lines were absolutely killer, and others felt so flat that I could be convinced it was made with generative AI. While on the topic of sound, yeah, it's great. Swords sound great, the atmosphere is good, and the soundtrack is kick-ass. Normally, I would end my review here, but since it is a massive topic of discussion, I feel the need to address the samurai in the room, Ghost of Tsushima. Yes, this game does feel as though it was inspired by Tsushima, especially with the abundance of wind and particles, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Many would consider Ghost of Tsushima to have borrowed heavily from Assassin's Creed, so I'm fine with Ubisoft doing some borrowing of their own. Comparing the games, however, is rather difficult because one is an action-adventure game and the other an RPG. But, bearing the obvious difference in mind, I find it difficult to say one is better than the other. I think broadly, the combat is better in Tsushima along with the samurai fantasy, but the stealth in Shadows blows Tsushima out of the water, along with the shinobi fantasy. I think Tsushima is generally prettier, but the different seasons of Shadows, along with how absolutely massive its towns and map is, gives Tsushima a run for its money. Content-wise, Tsushima has a better story and the side content is pretty similar for both, though Shadows obviously has a lot more content to offer. Doesn't matter that much to me, but if it matters to you, then there you go. The game took me about 40 hours to beat, though I was taking my time enjoying side activities and trying different things, so I imagine only focusing on the main story will take around 30. Both games have enough content to justify the price and have a high enough quality standard to do the same. I think most importantly, this conversation should be less which open world Japan game is better and instead, holy shit, we have two awesome open world Japan games. Which brings me to my final thoughts. I think in spite of the issues, this is a kick-ass game. To answer the titular question, yeah, I think you should buy it, assuming you like open world games and have enjoyed the previous Assassin's Creed RPG games. If you liked Mirage for abandoning a lot of the RPG mechanics or you were hoping this was a return to form, then I would not recommend this game. I would also not recommend this game for those that don't like the usual Ubisoft open worlds. I think this game is a solid step in the right direction, but it does not reinvent the wheel, and it still very much feels like a Ubisoft open world for better or worse. Combat was fine, especially once the glorious finishers got old, but the stealth is what's really going to keep me coming back. Being able to dress like a shinobi and crawl through the grass in a thunderstorm is something no other game can provide for now, and that's where this game's strengths lie, along with its open world, which as always is top-notch. I think there was a lot riding on Assassin's Creed Shadows to be good, both for the series and, as speculations would have me believe, Ubisoft as a company. And while I have no idea what sales will be like, I'm happy to know that Assassin's Creed Shadows was a good, fun game. So, let me know, are you going to buy Assassin's Creed Shadows? Why or why not? Of course, watch other reviews to make sure your opinion is as informed as possible, and thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Thank you also to our patrons, thank you again for watching, and have an excellent rest of your day.